Welcome to another edition of Christian Answers. My name is Pastor Jeff Short, and today I am outside in the cold weather. This is winter. This is the first real blast of winter that we've had this year, and so I am experiencing some of the effects of it because it's out here in the extreme cold. And you can see that I'm all bundled up, got my coat on, and I am ready for the elements. I don't know what we're going to get today. We're probably going to get some pretty cold weather, and I'm just going to walk and talk. That's my plan today. And I wanted to talk about a couple of things that were in the news, and one of the things that we've seen this week, the past week, was the death of rock star David Bowie. And it seems like the news media is making a lot about this. He was on the cover of Time magazine, and showing him and making him out to be a hero of sorts. And we have to analyze that from a Christian perspective because from my point of view, as a Christian, he was no hero. I do remember him as a teenager growing up. I remember him as a teenager growing up, and I remember his influence on my generation. And I have to say that it was not a good influence. There was all kinds of problems with his influence on my generation. And we're going to talk about that today, because in the midst of trying to express sympathy and in the midst of trying to say nice things and think nice thoughts about this man at his passing, we also have to be realistic. We have to evaluate him from a Christian perspective. And when we do, we realize that he was not a hero. Far from it. What he actually did was not very good as far as a Christian perspective is concerned. He was actually quite negative in his influence in the world. He did not in any way present himself as a good role model for teenagers or youth. And we have to remember that when we hear all these positive assessments of his life. We hear all this positiveness coming forth from people who say, oh, he was a great musician, he was a genius, he was a creative force in the world. You have to remember that it wasn't that way at all back then. I remember when I was growing up as a teenager, there were always musicians and artists who pushed the envelope, who pushed the limit, and they went far beyond what really were the bounds of acceptability from a Christian perspective. For example, David Bowie was always, as far as I can remember, one of these musicians, singers, artists, whatever you call them, who wanted to blur gender distinctions. He made it his career to try to present to the world this androgynous sort of male-female figure. He would dress up in female attire. He would try to fix his hair as if a female, in the style of a female, 70s female. He would try to present himself as this androgynous personality in his appearance. Now, he didn't sound in his voice and his singing, he didn't sound female, but he presented himself in that persona, actually dressing in feminine clothing. And so it was a real bad influence on my generation, growing up in the late 70s and 80s. He presented mixed messages and confusion, and the seeds of his confusion are so much, it's hard to even estimate the damage that he has done, he and others like him have done for the youth in this country, and around the world. I shouldn't say just the United States. It's in Europe, all over the world. His music has had wide influence, and it's a shame that it did. It would have been better if he had actually not had much influence in the world, if he had actually not had much of a voice in this world. Better would it have been if his voice had never been recognized or had never been heard because of the bad messages that he was sending to the youth of the world. So when we hear all of these fantastic memories of him, and we see all the Hollywood stars and entertainers and singers pour accolades upon someone like a David Bowie, we have to really set that in perspective. We have to say that's based on the values of Hollywood. That's based on a certain perspective of a godless, valueless population of people who, Hollywood, we might expect that kind of encouragement from. But if you were to go from the Bible's perspective, we would not want to give any kind of good assessment of his life and his influence, because it really isn't warranted. In fact, the opposite is a negative assessment, a bad assessment for his life would be warranted because of the problems that occur when you sow those seeds of confusion into an entire generation. If you look at what was actually taking place back then, you will see that this was coming from the generation that came out of the 60s generation. The 60s generation sowed a lot of confusion in the world. We're not even going to try to talk about that kind of confusion that was sown into the world. But the 60s generation sowed confusion, and you can't even calculate the measure of that confusion. But now we're here a few decades removed from the 60s, and we can look back and we can say some of these individual artists, they carried on the 60s rebellion. They carried on the confusion that was sown in the 60s. And so we have to say, look, this is not something that's positive. This is not something that's encouraging. We need to expose it for what it is. Let's not lionize this man. Let's not give him congratulations when he really deserves criticism. So stay tuned for part 2 of Christian Answers. We'll be back in just a second. Well, welcome once again to part 2 of Christian Answers. My name is Pastor Jeff Short, and I'm talking about today the whole situation where they are lionizing David Bowie. And we're trying to sort this out because as a Christian we want to understand the times in which we live. We are going through a time where people are saying what is good and true is false, and what is false and bad is good. This is exactly what the prophets in the Old Testament said. They said there's going to come a time when people call what is good false and bad, and what is false, they're going to call good. And we're seeing that happen today. The life of David Bowie is being held up as this genius entertainer who, and one of the quotes in the Time magazine article was that he was a shameless entertainer, and that was seen as a good thing. They saw that as a good thing. He's a shameless entertainer. In other words, he's a fearless entertainer. He's willing to do whatever it takes to satisfy his artistic impulse. Well, actually, that is a good description of him, but it's not a good thing. It's not a positive thing. It's a negative thing. A shameless entertainer, because he did shameless things. You have a man who, when he was interviewed once on television, they asked him, because of his androgynous themes, because his trying to imitate the appearance of a woman, and this is, remember, this is decades and decades before Bruce Jenner and his whole transgenderism sprang to the media's attention. He was asked, Bowie was asked on a radio interview or television interview, is he bisexual? And he basically said, I'm whatever it is that I feel. I'm whatever I feel. He basically gave the impression, that the categories, male, female, don't even relate to him, that he's above that. He transcends that he resents even having to explain himself. And so his whole attitude toward this was this casualness that he would come across as saying, I'm above that. I don't need to explain to you what I am. The interviewer kept trying to press him, are you bisexual? Are you this? Are you that? He would refused to categorize himself. He refused to even submit to any of those questions because he felt that was beneath him, and he felt that he transcended those questions. Well, that's just an example of an attitude that we now see that is all over society, and this is the sort of attitude that Bruce Jenner has in his trying to explain his transgenderism to the popular culture, specifically in his interviews and his appearances. He really resents, he doesn't like having to categorize himself in the classification of male or female. He wants to just be himself, and that is what Bowie was trying to do. He was trying to be himself, so-called self. But what that really is, when you get right down to it, what that attitude is rebellion against God, because God created the basic categories. And so when you take an attitude of, I am myself, I do what I want, I don't have to answer to anybody, you are basically saying, I don't have to submit to the normal classifications of gender. I don't have to submit to the normal classifications of male, female. I don't have to fit into society's labels. But see, it's not just society's labels. If it was just a social invention, that would be one thing. And a lot of these more sophisticated intellectual thinkers are trying to tell us, well, it's just a social classification. Male is a social classification. Female is a social classification. They're trying to tell us that the male-female arrangement in marriage is simply a social contract between two people that started with the basic male and female, but it's all human. See, they're trying to reduce everything to a human level. But as Christians, we know when we read our Bible and we listen to the teachings of Christ that male and female are not creations of society. These are not social constructs. These are rooted in the very created order of God Almighty. It goes right back to Genesis. It goes right back to Adam, the first human. It goes right back to Eve, his wife that God gave him. These are all God-established categories. And so when a David Bowie, or now, 20, 30 years later, a Bruce Jenner tries to sow seeds of confusion in society and saying, well, you don't have to be labeled male, female. You don't have to function in the gender of your birth. You can actually cross-gender. You can actually transgender. You can actually function as a female even though you are male. Or you can change the definition of male. You can change the definition of female. You can twist, you can pervert, you can turn, you can do whatever you want as a free, autonomous individual. And no one has a right to criticize you. No one has a right to say you shouldn't do that, because you are your own person. And that's what David Bowie was communicating to an entire generation with his persona, this androgynous persona, and his concert appearances. Now, he used music as the means to do that. If you listen to his music, and I don't understand what the great praise is for his music. His music, I've always understood his music as being odd, kooky, weird, strange. It really wasn't much of anything as far as I was concerned. And I did live through that era. And there were a number of bands and best-selling entertainers, and a lot of their music I did understand, and I understood what they were trying to say. I did not agree with a lot of what they were trying to say coming out of the 60s, the rebellion, the rock and roll, the sex, drugs, and rock and roll era. But I understood what they were saying. David Bowie was almost totally misunderstood and impossible to understand, and because of his lyrics. And I even read in one article where he would purposely throw words into a hat, draw them out randomly, and then put them into the words of a song, and that's what you got. So he wasn't trying to be logical. He wasn't trying to be rational. He very much irrational. And again, it was this breaking down of the categories of rationality and God's created order. He was sowing seeds of rebellion in society. And he did it with his music, and he did it with his appearances, his gender-bending agenda. And now we see the fruit of that coming to light today with the Bruce Jenner and the widespread acceptance of transgenderism, gay marriage, and all the other assorted perversities that have come along as a result. So David Bowie has a lot to do with this, what we see today. He was one of these high-profile musician, artists, entertainers, whatever you call them, who was laying the foundation for the Bruce Jenners and for the gay marriages and for all this stuff that we see today. And that's a sad thing. And we should not heap praise upon a man who really deserves criticism. And I have to say that he does not deserve praise. He deserves criticism because of what the damage he has done to an entire generation of youth. Not just one generation, but now multiple generations of youth. Well, that's for part 2 of Christian Answers. Don't go away. We'll be back for part 3 in just a second. Well, welcome to another episode of Christian Answers. We're on part 3. And as you can tell, I'm back inside right now. I'm not outside. I'm back inside. The camera froze up actually outside, and so we had to come back in here to the warmer weather to actually finish the taping of this program. But we were talking about David Bowie. I'm looking at the Time magazine article right here, in which David Bowie is on the cover. And reading through some of the content of this magazine, I was talking about the fact that David Bowie excelled in trying to push the boundaries of God's created order to their very limits and past the limits. We have from God in His Word the teachings about men and women. We have teachings about how that God created them male and female. This is taught in the early chapters of the book of Genesis. You could just turn to any Bible, go to the very first chapter and the second chapter, and you will find that these are teachings throughout the Bible, that men are supposed to be men and women are supposed to be women. It talks about further in the Old Testament how men are not supposed to confuse their appearance with that of a woman, and a woman is not to confuse her appearance with that of a man. We have that teaching. Now, we might look at that and say, well, why is that in the Bible? What is the deal there? Why does God put that in there? He wants to maintain the categories that He established in the Garden of Eden, in the beginning, when He created man and woman. He wants to establish those categories. He does not want confusion sown in society. He does not want people wondering what gender they are. This new theory, the gender theory, says that you can actually be born a man, but then actually be a woman inside, or you can be a woman, born a woman, but actually be a man inside. And so you have this total confusion of the categories. God doesn't want that to happen. He's actually, what we see today is totally what God does not want to happen. He does not want men and women to have doubts about who they are. He does not want there to be this widespread confusion that's being sown in society like we see today. It's almost ridiculous. There was just a law passed in one of the states in our country where it is now legal for a boy to play in women's sports at his school if he decides that he wants to self-identify as a woman. It is now the case where some boy, some teenage guy, can go into the girls' locker room under the guise that he wants to play women's sports because he feels like a woman inside. Okay, that is insanity. That is totally disregarding any kind of rational, logical, human categories of gender, and it's totally making a mockery of God's created order, and we're seeing that in society more and more today. That is not simply a very bad nightmare that someone might have of some future event that would happen. This is happening today. This confusion is deep and it's widespread. And you know what? We can thank people like David Bowie for that confusion, because they were doing that back 20, 30, 40 years ago with their music and their concert appearances and their expressions of this androgynous ideal. David Bowie was confusing the categories 40, 30, 40, 20 years ago, and now we see it happening very commonly today with the Bruce Jenner and that whole transgender movement. We're seeing what happened back then now played out, and we see the fruits of it today. So when we look at David Bowie's life, when we read articles in Time magazine, when we see specials on the network television about him, we're only going to hear about his creativity. We're only going to hear about his fearlessness, willingness to go to whatever lengths to express his artistic creativity. We're not going to hear about what the real situation is, and the real situation is this man confused a lot of teenagers during his lifetime. He ruined a lot of lives, and we don't have statistics for that, but we can see it all around us. People who are living their lives with confusion, irrational thinking, perversity. We're seeing a lot of what we see today because of people like David Bowie. He was not the only one that was doing this kind of thing. There were others that were doing the same kind of thing. We see, for example, we see this picture of him dressed in pink and with his hair made up in the style of a woman. We see that happening. That kind of stuff was going on during the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And we see him on stage here dressed in a dress. And he had high heels on. And there's all kinds of just outrageous wardrobe that he displayed, and this was all sowing the seeds of confusion that we have today in our society. No wonder we have people like Bruce Jenner. No wonder we have things like gay marriage now legal in our country. No wonder we have these things, because they were all foretold, and the groundwork was laid way back in the early 70s and the 80s with people like David Bowie. So when we look at the life of a David Bowie, we do not see some hero, we don't see some role model, positive role model, we don't see some great person. We see a very confused person who unfortunately was allowed to confuse generation after generation of young people. When you see his concert footage, when you see the videos that were taken and the film that was taken at his concerts, you would see a wave of youth. I mean, we're talking thousands, tens of thousands of young teenagers would go to his concerts and look up to him, literally look up to him. He's on the stage, and they would adore him, they would applaud him, they would idolize him. And his philosophy was spread through these concerts, through his television appearances, his music videos, his music on the radio. I mean, his kind of rebellion was spread far and wide, worldwide. We're talking about a man who had worldwide influence, and his kind of rebellion was spread worldwide. There's no question about that. So when we look at this person and we look at the fruit of his labor, it's disaster. It's total disaster. And he's not the only one. I shouldn't make it sound like he is the only one that basically is to blame for what we see today in the confusion of the sexes and the confusion of gender. But he is a major player in that movement, the transgender movement, the sexual revolution, the whole thing, like dealing with the 60s, where the categories and morality of Christianity and the Bible was totally thrown out. He pushed it even further than the flower children of the 60s. They were expressing mostly, for the most part, heterosexual immorality, fornication, as the Bible calls it, and adultery. But this person, David Bowie, and people like him pushed it even further. And they encouraged actually the transgenderism, transvestitism, and all of the other perversions that we could name. So when we look at his life, when we evaluate his entire expression, we have to say, sadly, that it was negative. And we need to never, ever hold people like this in high esteem and hold them up and give them some kind of a positive assessment. They don't deserve it. They deserve a negative assessment for what they have done in our world. And we look around today and we see the fruit of their labor, and it's bad fruit. So unfortunately, I have to end on a negative note, but I wanted to bring this to you and give you something to think about so that you can understand the times in which we live. God bless you, and we'll see you back here at Christian Answers next week.